It wasn't supposed to be like this. I thought it would be a simple job. Stay awake, watch some cameras, maybe deal with a stray visitor. Nothing more. But now I'm crouched here in the shadows, praying they don't find me. They're getting closer. Every step sounds heavier, slower, like they're savoring the hunt. The rules warned me about this. I should have taken them more seriously. But now it's too late. All I can do is hide and hope. I've always been awake when the world sleeps. As a kid, bedtime felt like a punishment. My body didn't understand the concept of sleep before sunrise. Instead, I'd stare at the ceiling, counting the hours until morning. School was hell. Every day started with exhaustion. Teachers scolded me for sleeping through their lessons. I couldn't tell them that nights were when I truly came alive. By the time I turned 16, I realized something. If I'm going to be awake all night, I might as well get paid for it. Security seemed like the perfect fit. I'm tall, I go to the gym, and people tend to think twice before messing with someone who looks like me. But if you scratched beneath the surface, you'd find a guy who'd rather talk his way out of trouble than throw a punch. Most shifts were boring. University dorms, fast food joints, the occasional warehouse. Easy money, but nothing memorable. That changed when my boss called me into his office. My boss was a man of few words. He didn't waste time with small talk. That day he got straight to the point. There's a job, night shift, 3 days. It's at a hospital, my boss said. A hospital? That was new. Most of our gigs involved empty buildings, places where the biggest threat was a raccoon tripping the motion sensors. It pays triple your usual rate. But it's specific, needs someone experienced. Someone trustworthy, my boss replied. He didn't say it outright, but I could tell he'd struggled to find someone for this job. The way his shoulders relaxed when I agreed told me everything I needed to know. You've got it, sir. When do I start? Thursday. Be there by 10 p.m. sharp. And Steve, follow the instructions. No exceptions. I should have asked more questions. But triple pay? It felt like a no-brainer. I shook his hand and left the office with a smile, completely unaware of what I'd just signed up for. The hospital stood out immediately. It didn't look like the ones you see in movies. Bright, sterile, full of life. This place felt forgotten. The kind of building that belonged in a history book, not a modern city. I arrived early, partly because I wanted to make a good impression, but mostly because I wanted to scope the place out. Something about it didn't sit right with me. Welcome. You must be Steve. You're early. Her cheerfulness felt forced, like a bad actor trying to sell a role. But I smiled back and nodded. That's me. I'm here for the night shift. Of course. Let me check you in. Would you like some coffee while you wait? The coffee tasted different. Rich, almost too good for a place like this. I didn't think much of it at the time, but looking back, even the smallest details felt off. That's when I met him. The other security guard. He was everything you'd expect from someone in this line of work. Tall, broad, and silent. The kind of guy who didn't need to speak to make his point. You're the new guy? Follow me. No introductions, no small talk, just a direct command. I followed him down a hallway, the silence between us almost deafening. Here's how the cameras work. You'll patrol the building every hour. Stick to the schedule, stick to the rules, read them, follow them. No exceptions. If you break them, we'll know. I picked up the paper, my curiosity outweighing my unease. 7 rules, each more bizarre than the last. I laughed at first, thinking it was some kind of joke. But deep down, I knew this job was anything but ordinary. I sat there, alone in the security room. The paper in my hands felt heavier than it should. 7 rules. 7 strange, cryptic rules written in bold letters, almost daring me to laugh them off. Rule 1. Your shift will begin at 10 p.m. Make sure you are inside the security room by that time. From 10:15 p.m. until 11 p.m., patrol the building to ensure no individuals are present. If you encounter anyone, kindly ask them to leave. Straightforward enough. Basic security stuff. Rule 2. Somewhere between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m., a young woman may appear at the front door asking to see her husband. Ignore her completely and pretend she isn't there until she leaves. Now that's weird. Rule 3. Ensure that the lights inside the intensive care unit remain on throughout your shift. If they turn off, go to the ICU immediately and turn them back on. If you hear screaming while the lights are off, run to the nearest bathroom and stay there until the screaming stops. Then proceed to turn the lights back on. Okay, that one made the hairs on my neck stand up. Screaming? Bathrooms? What kind of place was this? Rule 4. If there's a little girl with a teddy bear in the cafeteria, sit next to her and don't say a word. If she looks at you, return to the security room. If she speaks to you, talk back until she leaves. Rule 5. Around 1 a.m., check on the patients in the general ward. If one of them is sitting on their bed, ask if they're okay and do whatever they request. Beyond that, ignore them. Rule 6. If it starts raining, open the front door and let people inside for shelter. Ensure everyone leaves the building before your shift ends. If someone seems to be missing, you will see them on the security cameras. Do not look directly at them. Rule 7. If the security cameras turn off at any time during the night, hide immediately. Stay hidden until the cameras turn back on. If they don't, well, you won't be around to find out. My first thought was that this had to be a prank, someone's idea of hazing the new guy. But something about the way the other guard looked at me, serious, almost grim, made me think otherwise. I told myself I'd follow the rules. Not because I believed in them, but because I didn't want to be the guy who couldn't hack it. It's just 3 nights, I thought. How bad could it be? The first patrol was uneventful. The hospital felt too quiet, like the walls were holding their breath. Room after room, hallway after hallway, nothing, not a soul in sight. But there was something off. Hospitals are supposed to be alive, even at night. Nurses, doctors, patients. Here, there was only silence. It didn't make sense. I almost called out, but then I remembered Rule 1. Kindly ask them to leave. Simple enough. Excuse me, sir. You're not supposed to be here. I'll need you to leave. The old man turned slowly, his face pale and drawn. His eyes met mine, and for a moment neither of us spoke. Be careful of the surgeon. The man's voice is barely above a whisper, but the words hung in the air like a warning. My expression hardened. I told myself it was part of the test, an actor hired to mess with me. That's all it was. It had to be. The old man shuffles past me and disappears down the hallway. I watched him go, his grip tightening on the flashlight. Still, his words stuck with me. Be careful of the surgeon. What surgeon? The hospital was empty, or so I thought. I sat in the security room, my eyes on the monitors. The clock on the wall reads 11 p.m. A soft knock broke the silence. At first I thought I'd imagined it, but then it came again. A knock at the front door. The monitors showed a woman standing outside, her face obscured by the shadows. She's dressed in a hospital gown, her hair disheveled. She raised a hand and knocked again. Rule 2, ignore her completely. Pretend she isn't there. Easy, right? The woman's voice carries through the quiet. It was shaky, desperate. Please, I need to see my husband. He's here. Let me in. My jaw tightens. I glanced at the rules on the desk, then back at the monitor. The woman pressed her palms against the glass. Her voice kept rising. Please, don't let him take me. Don't let him. I wanted to help her. Every instinct told me to open that door, but the rules were clear. And something about the way she moved. It wasn't right. The knocking turned to pounding. The woman's silhouette shifted unnaturally, her movements jerky and frantic. I griped the edges of the desk. I stayed in that chair, pretending she wasn't there. Eventually, the noise stopped. When I looked back at the monitor, she was gone. But the unease lingered, crawling under my skin. The clock struck midnight. My eyes were heavy as I stared at the monitors. Suddenly, the feed for the ICU goes dark. The lights in the ICU went out. just like Rule 3 said they might. I stared at the monitor, hoping they'd come back on their own. They didn't. I grabbed my flashlight and heads for the ICU. The hallways feel narrower, the shadows deeper. A faint sound reached my ears, a low, guttural scream. It started as a distant wail, growing louder with each step I took. By the time I reached the ICU, it was deafening. I stood frozen at the entrance to the ICU. The screams echo around me, filling the empty space. I glance at the nearest bathroom and bolts inside, locking the door behind me. The rules were clear. If you hear screaming, hide. So that's what I did. I hid and waited, my back pressed against the cold tile wall. The screams stop abruptly. Silence. I hesitated and then slowly unlocked the door. I stepped into the hallway, my flashlight shaking slightly. I made my way back to the ICU and turned the lights on. The room was empty, just as it had been before. But something felt different. The air was heavier, the shadows darker. I hurried back to the security room, my movement tensed. I told myself I'd done everything right. I followed the rules. But deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. The cafeteria felt colder than the rest of the hospital. The air had a stale, almost metallic taste to it. As I stepped inside, my boots echoed softly against the tiled floor. The space was empty. At least, that's what I thought at first. Then I saw her. I froze as I spotted a little girl seated at one of the tables. She's dressed in a white dress, slightly smudged with dirt. Her blonde curls fall just below her shoulders. In her arms, she clutches a teddy bear with one button eye barely hanging on. She looks so out of place, like she didn't belong to this time or place. My first thought was that someone must have left her here. A nurse, or maybe a parent. But deep down, I knew better. The rules came rushing back to me. Lifia, sit next to her. Don't say a word. As I approached her cautiously, my hands trembled slightly. I pulled out a chair and sits next to her. The girl doesn't acknowledge me at first. Her eyes remain fixed on the teddy bear in her lap. I could feel her presence like a weight pressing against me. The silence stretched on, growing heavier with each passing second. I wanted to say something, anything, to break the tension, but the rules said not to speak unless she did. The girl finally turned her head, her pale blue eyes locking onto me. Her face is expressionless, her gaze unblinking. Why are you scared? I was stiffened, my lips parted as if to respond, but I cautioned myself. The girl tilts her head slightly, studying me. Her voice was soft but carried an unsettling edge. You're not supposed to talk to me, but you already broke the rules, didn't you? My stomach twisted into knots. I hadn't said a word, but she spoke like she already knew I'd failed. Maybe it was the way I sat, the way my shoulders tensed. Something gave me away. The girl's lips curl into a slow, unnatural smile. Her voice took on a sing-song quality. You broke the rules. Now we'll play hide and seek. The sound of her giggle fills the cafeteria, echoing off the walls. I pushed back from the table, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. I stumbled to my feet and backed away. I didn't wait for her to explain. I didn't ask what she meant. I just ran. My boots slammed against the floor as I bolted for the security room. I bursted into the security room, slamming the door shut behind me. I leaned against it, catching my breath. My eyes darted to the monitors, but the screens were black. The cameras, they were off. Rule 7, hide immediately. The faint sound of footsteps reached my ears, followed by the soft, taunting voice of the little girl. 1, 2, 3, forever with me you'll be. My body moved before my mind could catch up. I grabbed the flashlight and threw open the door, scanning the hallway for a hiding spot. Her voice was getting closer, each number sending a jolt through me. I sprinted down a hallway, my breathing uneven. My glances over my shoulder, but the hallway behind me were empty. The girl's voice continued, growing louder and more melodic. 4, 5, 6. In the shadows you'll mix. There were no good options. The bathrooms? Too obvious. The ICU? Too exposed. My eyes darted to the ceiling tiles. They looked fragile, but it was my best chance. I climbed onto a nearby chair and pushed a ceiling tile aside. I hoist myself up, the structure groaning under my weight. I carefully replaced the tile, leaving just enough of a gap to peer through. The space above the ceiling was cramped and dusty. I could feel the tiles sagging beneath me with every movement. I held my breath, praying she wouldn't find me. Through the gap, I saw the little girl enter the hallway below. She walked slowly, dragging her teddy bear along the floor. Her steps were deliberate, each one echoing ominously. "I know you're here, Steve. You can't hide forever." She stopped directly beneath my hiding spot. The camera showed her tilting her head, as if listening for his breathing. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. My muscles screamed at me to adjust, to shift my weight, but I stayed still. If the tiles gave way, it would be over. The girl suddenly slammed the teddy bear against the wall, the sound reverberating through the hallway. She laughed, a high-pitched, unnerving sound. "I'll find you. Then we'll have so much fun." She skipped down the hallway, her voice fading into the distance. I exhaled shakily, my relief short-lived as the ceiling tile beneath me began to crack. The tile couldn't hold my weight much longer. I had to move. I carefully shifted my position, but the tile gave way slightly, sending a soft creak through the empty hallway. I froze, listening for any sign of the girl's return. Hearing nothing, I slowly climbed down and landed softly on the floor. I needed another hiding spot. Somewhere safer. Somewhere she wouldn't think to look. I tiptoed through the hallway, my flashlight illuminating the path ahead. I heard a distant sound, a low, metallic scraping. My pace quickened as I approached the janitor's closet. I slipped inside, shutting the door quietly behind myself. The closet was cramped, filled with cleaning supplies and old equipment. I crouched behind a stack of boxes, trying to steady my breathing. The sound of the girl's footsteps grew louder, accompanied by her haunting voice. 7, 8, 9, you'll never be fine. The door handle rattled. My eyes widened as the door creaks open slightly. The girl's shadow fell across the floor, stretching toward me. I pressed myself deeper into the corner, willing myself to disappear. Her footsteps stopped just outside the closet. "Steve, come out, wherever you are." The door creaks opened wider, but before she could step inside, a loud crash echoes from the other end of the hallway. The girl's head snapped towards the noise. Something distracted her. I don't know what it was, and I didn't care. All I knew was that I had to move. Now, as the girl ran toward the source of the noise, I slipped out of the closet and moved in the opposite direction. My footsteps were quick but silent, my eyes darting for another safe spot. I found myself back near the ICU. I leaned against the wall, catching my breath. The hallway was eerily silent now. I thought I'd escaped her. For a moment, I let myself believe I was safe, but then I heard it. A voice, low and guttural, coming from the darkness. "I need to inspect your organs." My eyes widened in terror. The sound of slow, deliberate footsteps echoed down the hallway. It wasn't the girl this time. It was something else, something worse. The janitor's closet was my last refuge. The walls closed in around me as I squeezed into the corner, hiding behind stacks of cleaning supplies and an old mop. I'd never felt so small, so utterly helpless. The air inside was thick, damp, and reeked of chemicals. My ears strained to catch every sound outside the door. My trembling hand reached out to turn off the flashlight. Darkness engulfs the tiny space. The sound of slow, deliberate footsteps echoed in the hallway. He was out there. I didn't need to see him to know that. The footsteps had a weight to them, each one landing with purpose, and then the sound I'd been dreading. A voice, low, guttural, and dripping with malice. "You can't hide from me forever." My breath hitched. I pressed myself tighter against the wall, willing myself to disappear. Through the crack beneath the door, I could see a faint shadow moving back and forth. He was pacing, as if savoring the hunt. The sound of metal scraping against metal fills the air, sharp and grating. My eyes widened in the dark. The scraping sound sent chills through me. It wasn't random. It was deliberate, like someone sharpening a blade. And then I heard it, a scream. High-pitched and filled with agony. It came from somewhere down the hall, but it felt like it was right next to me. The scream cuts off abruptly, replaced by muffled cries. My hands clutch my knees, my body shaking. He wasn't alone. Someone else was in this hospital. Someone who wasn't supposed to be here. And they were at his mercy. The surgeon's voice grew louder, more menacing. "Let's see what's inside you." I've always been curious. My mind raced. This wasn't just some deranged man. No human spoke like that, moved like that. Whatever he was, it was something far worse. Something I couldn't begin to understand. I was drenched in sweat as the sounds outside grew quieter. The shadow disappeared from beneath the door. The silence was almost worse than the noise. I stayed frozen, waiting, listening. Minutes felt like hours. But then I heard the faintest whisper. "I'll come back for you." When I was sure he was gone, I slipped out of the closet. My legs felt like they'd betray me at any second, but I forced them to move. The hallway was empty, but the air was heavy, like the hospital itself was watching me. I crept through the hallway, my flashlight flickering weakly. I checked the clock on the wall, 4:37 a.m. I just had to make it to dawn. Less than 2 hours. But each second felt like it was dragging me closer to the edge of something I couldn't escape. As I turned a corner, I froze. The little girl stood at the far end of the hallway, her teddy bear dangling from one hand. Her head tilts slightly as she stares at me. She was back. The rules had warned me about her, but nothing could prepare me for the way she moved, the way she looked. Her eyes were too bright, too knowing. "You've been naughty, Steve. You broke the rules." Her voice was soft, almost playful, but it carried an edge that made my chest tighten. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on her. But she just smiled and began to hum. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing loudly. The girl's humming grew louder, chasing me through the corridor. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to get away. Every turn led me deeper into the maze of the hospital, and no matter how far I ran, her humming was always right behind me. I bursted into the ICU, slamming the door shut behind him. I locked it and leaned against the wall, gasping for air. The room was empty, but it didn't feel safe. Nothing in this place did. The monitors beeped softly, a cruel reminder that this was supposed to be a place of healing. The lights flickered overhead. My eyes darted to the door as the humming stopped. And then, the sound I'd been dreading. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and far heavier than the little girl's. He was here. The door handle rattled. I scrambled to hide behind a curtain, my eyes fixed on the door. It creaks open slowly, revealing the surgeon. His silhouette fills the doorway, casting long shadows across the room. He stepped inside, his movements unnaturally smooth. In his hand, he held something sharp, something that gleamed under the fluorescent light. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't see me. The surgeon's head turned slowly, scanning the room. He stepped closer to my hiding spot, his footsteps echoing softly. "You can't hide forever, Steve." My mind ran wildly. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't outrun him. But maybe I could outsmart him. I grabbed a metal tray from the table beside me and threw it across the room. It clattered loudly, drawing the surgeon's attention. As the surgeon moved toward the noise, I slipped out from behind the curtain and bolts for the door. I ran like my life depended on it, because it did. The hallways blurred around me as I searched for any way out, any place he wouldn't think to look. I spotted a vent near the floor and dropped to my knees, prying it open with my trembling hands. I crawled inside, pulling the cover back into place just as the surgeon's footsteps approached. The vent was cramped and suffocating, but it was better than facing him. I crawled as quietly as I could, each movement sending echoes through the metal. I didn't know where it led, but anywhere was better than here. The surgeon's voice echoes through the vent, cold and mocking. "You're clever, Steve, but not clever enough." His words sent chills down my spine, but I kept moving, The vent sloped downward, leading me to a room I didn't recognize. I pushed the cover off and dropped down, landing awkwardly on the floor. The room was dark, filled with old medical equipment covered in dust. My flashlight flickers back to life, illuminating a door at the far end. I didn't hesitate. I ran to the door and threw it open, stepping into the cool pre-dawn air. The sky was tinged with the faintest hint of light. I'd made it. The staff found me sitting on the curb outside, shaking and staring at nothing. They asked questions, but I couldn't answer. What could I say? That their hospital was haunted? That something inhuman roamed its halls? I quit that day. Whatever they were paying me, it wasn't worth my sanity. I told myself I'd never set foot in that place again. As I left, I noticed a new security guard entering the hospital. The guard looked young, eager, and naive. In his hand he held a piece of paper with 7 rules printed on it. I wanted to warn him, to tell him to run. But I didn't. Some lessons, I guess, you have to learn the hard way. If you found this story captivating, kindly like, subscribe, and share.